Aspen Lockwood had spent her childhood in glossy magazine spreads, drifting through a glittering existence of galas and opulent family gatherings. Yet beneath every layer of polished elegance, she felt the weight of her grandfather's immense fortune pressing on her heart like a silent judge. After his passing, she discovered that her so-called guardians intended to mold her life into a series of mergers and acquisitions, using her inheritance as bait to secure their business alliances. Rather than bend to their schemes, she made the most daring decision of her 22 years, she vanished. With only a single suitcase and a cloak of anonymity, she slipped away to a small, unremarkable town in a far-flung corner of the country, abandoning her birthright and adopting a name unknown in the realm of high society. The new life she carved out was almost monastic in its simplicity. She rented a shabby room in a dilapidated boarding house, where the peeling wallpaper and the lingering smell of stale cigarettes seemed far removed from her old existence of gilded banisters and crystal chandeliers. By day, she waited tables at a lonely diner on the highway's edge, forced to endure the sharp ache in her feet and the occasional unsolicited comment from beleaguered truckers. By night, she huddled in her cramped lodgings, flipping through old sketchbooks and diaries filled with half-formed dreams. Sometimes, she allowed herself a wistful gaze at photographs of her parents, an affectionate mother and an absent father whose role she'd never quite understood, tucked away in a battered envelope. Those images felt like postcards from a distant, otherworldly place. Yet anonymity, while providing a shield from her manipulative relatives, came at a steep emotional cost. Aspen drifted through each day with a constant undercurrent of anxiety. She watched every stranger in the diner, fearing someone might recognize a resemblance to the famed Lockwood features or carry news that her guardians were closing in on her whereabouts. Despite her caution, she began to run low on money. The modest wages from the diner barely covered her rent and the occasional meal of instant noodles. Her studio art supplies, once a passion she nurtured with private tutors, lay nearly forgotten in a box beneath her bed, a silent testament to a life on hold. It was in this fragile state, hovering on the brink of financial collapse, that she first heard whispered rumors about an unusual arrangement at a secluded estate. Late at night, while refilling the coffee cups of local ranchers or tired travelers, Aspen overheard hushed conversations about a blind billionaire named Thorne Kingsley, famed for his inherited empire and feared for the ironclad secrecy of his private affairs. The rumors suggested Thorne sought a companion in the most literal, intimate sense, a woman who would share his home, offering an exchange of emotional solace and, some said, her innocence. In return, the billionaire would grant financial stability so absolute that debt would become a memory. The story sounded like a twisted fairy tale, a recluse trapped in a gilded cage of shadows, longing to possess what he could not see. Most dismissed it as a dark rumor spun from local folklore, but for Aspen, it ignited a spark of desperate possibility. She fought against the lure of that rumor. Trading her virginity, her very self, for a lifeline of wealth felt impossibly grim. Yet each day that passed brought a new eviction threat, another final notice from the electric company, more calls from the landlady who demanded overdue rent. Without a plan, she would soon be out on the street. The notion of returning to her old life, of letting her guardians corral her like an asset to be traded in marriage, was unthinkable. And so, after many nights of sleepless torment, she made the second most fateful decision of her life. She gathered what little remained of her savings, packed up her threadbare belongings, and left a terse note for the diner's owner resigning from her job. Under the pretense of anonymity, she traveled by a series of shabby buses to the remote county where Thorne Kingsley's estate stood on an expanse of rolling hills and dense pines. The final leg of the journey took her by foot along a winding dirt road that led to a pair of imposing iron gates. There, as a hush settled over the twilight sky, Aspen was struck by the strangeness of her predicament. She had fled one form of entrapment, her manipulative relatives and a future not of her choosing, only to willingly seek out another uncertain fate. But in the deafening quiet, the looming silhouette of a grand manor ahead, she steeled herself with the knowledge that she was doing this on her own terms. Whatever awaited her, a blind billionaire rumored to be as unyielding as the fortune he commanded, or perhaps a hidden longing in his heart, Aspen vowed she would face it with the resolve to remain as true to herself as circumstances would allow. The sun had nearly disappeared when she finally approached the manor's grand entrance. A tall attendant with a polite but impassive demeanor opened the door, leading her through a corridor lined with portraits and antique mirrors that glinted even in the dim light. Eventually, she was guided into a sitting room where the hush of the space seemed to echo her thudding heart. She couldn't help but notice the exquisite furnishings, brocade sofas, dark-paneled walls, and an ornate grandfather clock counting out each second like a pronouncement of fate. Drawing a shaky breath, Aspen braced herself for the meeting that would determine her future. Yes, she had come here of her own will, but everything from this moment on was laden with the precarious hope of freedom from debt and a new identity, yet at the cost of her innocence and a lifetime of possible regrets. As the door quietly swung open once more, Aspen turned to see a figure pause at the threshold, a tall man with a bearing that exuded calm authority, though he carried a polished cane in one hand. His eyes, clouded with the veil of blindness, nonetheless swept her direction with unsettling precision. Without a word, he advanced with measured, unhurried steps, each echo of his shoes on the marble floor announcing a presence used to absolute control. And in that charged instant, with the silent staff receding and only the faint tick of the clock filling the room, Aspen realized she was standing at the brink of her most perilous bargain yet, one that promised both a potential salvation and the risk of emotional entanglements far deeper than she had foreseen. Aspen stood in the manor's reception room with her heart pounding, her gaze darting over every elegant detail she could catch in the low, golden light. She'd barely had time to process her arrival before a silent, attentive staff member ushered her in and vanished, leaving her alone amid the hush of expensive furnishings and the steady ticking of an antique clock. She tried to steady her breath, wondering what to expect from the fabled blind billionaire who had invited her here. Rumors abounded of his cold demeanor, yet the faint echoes of hushed footsteps behind her suggested a world more alive and watchful than any tale could convey. She kept her back straight, each second of waiting stretching with excruciating tension, until the door on the far side of the room opened once again. Thorne Kingsley entered quietly, tapping a slim, ebony cane against the polished marble floor. Though his eyes were clouded by blindness, he moved with precise confidence, head tilted slightly as if discerning her presence through sound and scent rather than sight. The staff member guiding him offered no introductions, she simply bowed and vanished, leaving Aspen face to face with the man whose name carried both intrigue and intimidation. She noted how he paused in the room's center, each breath measured, as though reading every subtle nuance in the air. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant, an assured calm that belied the swirl of curiosity Aspen sensed beneath. "You're the one who came unannounced," he said, neither question nor accusation, simply a statement of fact. Summoning her courage, Aspen approached him with careful steps. She introduced herself under the pseudonym she'd chosen, a name that gave away nothing of her true identity as the heiress who had run from her inheritance. Thorne's blind gaze seemed to dissect every syllable she offered, as though he could sense the tension behind her voice. For a moment, she feared he might question her story. Instead, he simply nodded, faintly acknowledging her disguise without challenge. "I've heard that you seek a solution," he murmured, allowing the last word to linger, echoing her real reason for coming. Yes, a solution. He was rumored to provide one, in exchange for a price that blazed with moral ambiguity. Aspen swallowed hard. The hush that ensued pressed on her, the manor's opulent hush somehow magnifying the sound of her nervous heartbeat. "I'm told you can offer financial rescue," she ventured, her voice tight. I've reached the end of my resources, and I'm desperate. But I also," she hesitated, grappling with how to phrase her predicament without divulging her true self. "I also heard you might be interested in someone to share your home, your life, in a very personal arrangement." The words felt brittle on her tongue, she half expected condemnation in his reaction. Yet Thorne's composure remained unbroken. He gestured for her to follow him, leading her out of the reception room and into a long corridor lined with carved wooden panels and discreetly lit alcoves. She noticed how seamlessly he navigated, never once faltering, as if he had memorized every inch of this sprawling estate. He guided her into a smaller room, a private study, by the look of the leather-bound books on shelves and the faint smell of old paper. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in an intimate space where only the muted lamplight revealed the dust motes dancing in the air. Thorne took a seat at a large mahogany desk. With a subtle flick of his wrist, he indicated a chair for her. She eased down, her pulse thrumming with the sense that everything in her life was pivoting on this one conversation. He began by explaining, in calmly measured tones, the nature of the arrangement he sought. He was tired of shallow transactions with opportunists who pitted his blindness or coveted his wealth. He wanted a companion, someone honest enough to share his existence without the pretense that usually swirled around him, someone who would not recoil from the realities of his sightless world. In exchange, he would provide not just financial security, but also a place by his side, in a life that had long been empty of genuine connection. The mention of a place by his side reverberated within Aspen, for it suggested something deeper than the usual ephemeral deals she had heard whispered about. Throughout his monologue, Aspen felt an odd empathy stir within her. Behind Thorne's carefully constructed composure, she sensed loneliness and a longing for warmth he refused to name aloud. Was it truly so different from her own craving to be free from the shackles of a fate she had abandoned? Yes, the terms were unorthodox, maybe even scandalous: her virginity, her intimacy, in exchange for the complete erasure of her financial peril, but the yearning she glimpsed in his voice reminded her of her own hidden despair. When he finished, Thorne placed his hands lightly on the desk, fingers barely brushing the smooth surface. He waited, and she understood he was giving her space to speak freely. Aspen inhaled, bracing herself. With halting honesty, she recounted her dire straits, the menacing debts, the risk of soon being homeless, her desire to break free from an inheritance that had once promised everything and delivered only misery. She omitted her family name, of course, but the substance of her plight remained stark and raw. As she spoke, Thorne listened in impassive silence, yet she noticed the subtle clench of his jaw, the faint tension at the corners of his mouth, as though her words dredged up echoes of his own regrets. At last, he asked, in a voice as soft as dusk, "Are you sure this is what you want? To give away something so personal, so precious, for the sake of a life free from your burdens?" It was a question whose answer she had turned over in her mind countless times since she first learned of his rumored offer. Yet hearing it from him, this man who embodied both power and isolation, stirred a conflict in her heart. She wanted to retort that her virginity was not merely an object for barter, that the desperation she felt did not negate her dignity. But in the hush of the study, she swallowed those retorts, acknowledging that in her plight, maybe she had indeed reached a place where necessity trumped moral misgivings. "I have no illusions about this," she replied, her voice trembling. "It's not something I do lightly, nor is it something I ever thought I would do. But if it means I can start anew, far from the nightmares that chase me, then, yes, I'll consider it. If you promise me that I'll be safe here, and that you'll be honest in your intentions." Her heart hammered as she laid out her own terms, small but crucial. She demanded his respect, a level of control over her own life, and the freedom to leave if she found it impossible to remain. She half expected him to chuckle or dismiss her conditions as naive. Instead, after a pregnant pause, Thorne inclined his head in agreement. "Then let us proceed with caution," he said, each syllable weighted with the gravity of a solemn oath. "Stay here, in this house, as my guest. Get to know me, if you can, and allow me to know you beyond the shell of desperation you wear. If, after a time, we still find this arrangement agreeable, we will formalize it. But I give you my word, you are no prisoner here, nor will I treat your innocence as a commodity to be traded without regard." A wave of relief mingled with apprehension flooded Aspen. She knew that stepping into Thorne's world might unearth secrets of her own, and the lie of her assumed identity could eventually unravel. But the quiet compassion in his voice, the sense that he too fought his own demons, offered a peculiar solace. With a final murmured exchange, they concluded the conversation. Thorn summoned a staff member, instructing them to guide her to a quiet guest room in the manor's eastern wing. She left his study with her heart pounding, uncertain whether she had just sold her future or salvaged it. In the dim corridor, lit only by the faint glow of antique sconces, Aspen's thoughts ran wild. Part of her bristled at the notion that her worth was tied to so intimate a currency. And yet, the subtle yearning she had glimpsed in Thorn's demeanor, to not merely own but to connect, suggested an unexpected depth beneath the billionaire's polished veneer. Closing the door of her assigned suite behind her, she leaned against it, her pulse still racing. She was inside this labyrinth of secrets and yearnings now, forging a fragile union with a man who navigated darkness with an uncanny certainty. She only hoped that in the shifting sands of her new reality, her heart would guide her more faithfully than her fears, and that somewhere in this arrangement, she might find not just financial salvation, but the chance to define herself beyond her old, stifling inheritance. Morning light filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of Aspen's new quarters, revealing a space far more lavish than any she'd known in recent months. She awoke to the gentle hum of distant activity, a discreet bustle that spoke of a large household quietly going about its tasks. For a time, she lingered in bed, trying to reconcile the desperation that had led her here with the calm hush of Thorn Kingsley's estate. The events of the previous day still whirled in her mind, her introduction to the enigmatic billionaire, her acceptance of an unconventional pact, and the solemn vow that this was no mere transaction but a chance at something undefined, potentially intimate. Eventually, a soft knock broke the silence. A staff member, polite and reserved, brought in a tray bearing a simple breakfast, fresh fruit, warm bread, and tea in delicate china. Aspen thanked her quietly, careful to keep her voice steady lest her nerves betray the turmoil within. Once alone again, she sipped the tea and considered her next moves. Although Thorn had promised she was no prisoner, she felt the weight of unspoken obligations that tethered her to this manor. She reminded herself that she still carried a secret, the truth of her identity as an heiress, a detail she couldn't dare reveal until she was sure of Thorn's intentions. Trust was a currency she could ill afford to spend freely. Later that morning, as the sun rose higher, Aspen ventured out of her room with measured steps. She wandered through a winding corridor of polished floors and echoing ceilings, her curiosity piqued by the manor's silent grandeur. Ornate tapestries depicting centuries-old legends hung on the walls, and muted paintings of tranquil countrysides gave each corner an air of solemn history. She couldn't help but wonder what it was like for Thorn, blind, yet intimately familiar with these halls. Perhaps he navigated them by memory, each step a testament to his resolve not to let darkness claim him entirely. Drawn by a faint sense of invitation, she found herself standing before a sunlit conservatory. The glass walls opened up to a view of the estate's sprawling gardens, revealing a kaleidoscope of flowers in bloom. Yet, she spotted Thorn before the large windows, his back to her, one hand resting lightly on the glass. Despite the morning light, there was a poised tension in his posture, as if he were listening to the rhythms of a world he couldn't see. Uncertain how to approach, she cleared her throat softly. He turned his head at the sound, an almost imperceptible nod telling her to step forward. They stood together, separated by a polite distance. In the filtered sunlight, his features looked softer, though still touched by the composure of a man used to wielding power. "Good morning," he said, his voice low but not unkind. She answered in kind, offering a hesitant smile he couldn't see but seemed to sense. He asked if she'd slept well, if her room was comfortable, and she replied that it was far more than she deserved. "This is your home now," he reminded her with an almost stern gentleness. "I want you to feel, not indebted." The final words hung in the air, echoing the complexity of their arrangement. They spoke of small, safe topics first, her impressions of the manor, the staff who managed it with discreet efficiency, the faint scent of lavender that wafted in from the gardens. But soon, the conversation nudged toward the uneasy territory of their deal. Standing side by side, facing the garden's brilliance, Aspen dared to voice the apprehension that had gnawed at her since her arrival. "I don't know how to be what you need," she admitted softly, eyes fixed on a distant row of hedges. I've never. I mean, it's all so strange. My life changed overnight. I don't even know how to pretend I'm comfortable with it. Thorne exhaled as though grappling with ghosts of his own. I understand, he replied. It's strange for me too. I've spent so long pushing people away. This arrangement was supposed to solve a need, my need for companionship, some relief from the solitude. But in you, I sense more than just a necessary presence. There's a longing in your voice, a hidden story behind your borrowed name. He paused, and though his eyes remained clouded, she felt his full attention trained upon her. You're not merely a solution to my blindness or a contract to settle. There's more. I can hear it each time you speak, as if your heart yearns for a freedom you're still too fearful to claim. Tears threatened to blur Aspen's vision at his quiet observation. Rarely had anyone seen through her facade so swiftly. She lifted a hand to her cheek, as if to brush away the vulnerability she couldn't afford. I never meant to lie, she whispered, but my situation, my past, has forced me into hiding. If I told you everything, I'm not sure you'd even believe me. Her voice faltered. All I can say is that this arrangement, while it might save me from one set of horrors, could lead me into another. I'm terrified of falling into a different cage, albeit a gilded one. His hand drifted along the glass, then reached back into the room, a tentative gesture as if inviting her to place hers in his. She hesitated, then complied. His palm was warm, his grip light yet purposeful. I won't be your warden, he said in a tone that mingled assurance with a note of longing. If there's anything I know, it's that trust is fragile. But I'm asking you to trust me enough to let me in. And I, in turn, will do my best to offer the security you need, both from whatever pursues you and from the loneliness that's lived in my own heart. They lingered there for a time that felt suspended, as the sun climbed and softened the hush of the conservatory. Gradually, the tensions that had divided them softened, replaced by a precarious sense of kinship. Her secrets remained unspoken, his lonely existence still swathed in darkness, yet an understanding sparked between them, ephemeral and unexpected as a breeze stirring the garden's petals. Eventually, Thorne released her hand, turning to face the corridor beyond. Shall we explore the estate together, he offered. I'd like to show you the hidden corners of this place, through your eyes, if you'd allow it. His invitation, though couched in practicality, carried an undercurrent of a deeper yearning. Nodding, Aspen agreed, her pulse quickening at the intimate nature of such a request. By guiding him, she would literally become his eyes, forging a bond far more intimate than the cold contract that had first brought her here. As they left the conservatory, Aspen sensed they were embarking on a journey that reached beyond the estate's labyrinth of corridors. Each step in unison was a step into the unknown, a dance of secrets and revelations yet to come. In that warm hush, with Thorne at her side, Aspen felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps this precarious arrangement might yield not just financial relief, but a fresh beginning for them both, two souls seeking connection in a world that had shown them only harshness. And as they walked deeper into Thornwood Manor's secrets, the budding sense of possibility swelled, carrying them toward a future neither had foreseen yet both were, in their own way, already daring to envision. The high-ceilinged corridors of Thornwood Manor seemed to expand as Aspen guided Thorne, her arm looped gently through his as they wandered deeper into the estate. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, casting elongated squares of gold across the polished floors, and the hush in the air granted every whisper of their conversation a certain gravity. Aspen found her pulse thudding softly with every step, aware that in this shared exploration, she had become the eyes that Thorne lacked, describing everything from the subtle shifts in sunlight to the intricately carved banisters that flanked the grand staircase. His acute questions about color and shape made her realize how attuned he was, listening for the faintest quiver in her tone, as though he could sense even the hesitation behind her words. They passed rooms filled with relics of another era, anterooms brimming with old maps, a drawing room lined with dusty porcelain figurines. In each space, Aspen tried to evoke the scene vividly for Thorne, choosing adjectives that might spark his imagination. He never interrupted, merely nodded or offered a wry smile if her descriptions hinted at something amusing or improbable. She couldn't help but marvel at the paradox before her, a man reclusive enough to close himself off from the world, yet trusting her to convey the everyday wonders of his own home. The further they went, the more she sensed a flicker of longing in his questions, as if, through her words, he hoped to recapture the lost ability to see. Eventually, they arrived at a set of double doors carved with an ornate pattern of vines and flowers. Inside lay what appeared to be a gallery, its walls crowded with paintings from floor to ceiling, each canvas lit by a carefully placed lamp. Aspen inhaled sharply, her artist's heart instantly engaged by the diverse collection. Landscapes brimmed with color, portraits exuded quiet dignity, and a few abstract works teased the edges of comprehension. She led Thorne by the elbow, describing each painting in detail, the swirl of thick oil paint capturing the curvature of a hill, the vibrant burst of sunflowers in a gilded frame, the unsettling calm of a portrait that stared out with eerily lifelike eyes. Periodically, Thorne asked her to pause, inquiring about the nuance of a brushstroke or the interplay of contrasting shades, and she obliged, carefully selecting her words as though each detail were a puzzle piece he could fit into the mental image taking shape behind those sightless eyes. Their conversation deepened in that hushed gallery, with the faint hum of hidden climate control systems the only backdrop. The authenticity of Aspen's descriptions sparked something in Thorne, an evident relief that she wasn't merely a caretaker reciting bland facts. When she hesitated at one especially haunting painting, an untitled depiction of a lone figure wreathed in flame-like ribbons, he recognized the catch in her breath. "It resonates with you?" he asked, turning his face in her direction. She swallowed, grappling with how to respond without revealing her own carefully protected truth. "Yes," she admitted softly. "It reminds me of someone trapped between two worlds, one bright and full of life, the other threatening to consume them." Her voice faltered, and he reached out, fingertips grazing the edge of the canvas as though wishing he could decipher its texture. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "Sometimes we stand at a threshold, not sure which side holds safety and which side holds danger." Startled by how closely his words echoed her inner struggle, Aspen retreated a step, blinking away the emotion welling in her eyes. She recalled how she had once inhabited the gleaming world of private boarding schools and elite debutante balls, only to flee when her inheritance became a noose. Now, hiding behind a false name in Thorne's domain, she longed to tell him that she understood his isolation better than she let on. But fear bound her tongue. One slip could bring the predators in her family racing to the estate's doorstep, and she couldn't bear the thought of Thorne's trust shattering if he discovered she wasn't the destitute runaway she pretended to be. Sensing her distress, Thorne placed a hand lightly on her arm, guiding her away from the painting. He suggested they move on, to find a quieter spot where they could sit and talk without the looming presence of so many haunted eyes on the walls. Soon, they were in a small, cozy alcove off the gallery, furnished with 2 plush chairs and a narrow table that held a single vase of fresh wildflowers. A large window let in a slice of evening sun, painting the room with a gentle radiance. With a careful gesture, Thorne invited her to sit, and she complied, folding her hands in her lap. In that intimate, softly lit space, their conversation turned personal. He spoke first, apologizing for any perceived pressure on her to keep up the charade of this arrangement. "I feel as though I forced you into an agreement by offering you no alternative," he admitted, voice solemn. "Yet in these past days, I've come to anticipate your presence, your descriptions, your laughter, even your silences." There was no mistaking the conflict etched into every syllable. He remained the formidable figure rumored among corporate circles, but a man who now found himself unsteady in the realm of emotional connection. A sudden vulnerability that Aspen sensed was as profound as her own hidden secrets. She replied with equal candor, confessing her growing confusion about the lines between duty and genuine affection. "This arrangement has given me a purpose, I think, but also a sense of belonging in a house that feels both grand and lonely. I'm not used to that." Her voice wobbled with the weight of truth left unsaid, but the admission felt like a step closer to an authenticity she was simultaneously drawn to and afraid of. Together, they reached a silent truce for the evening, acknowledging that trust was precarious and intangible, something they would have to build piece by fragile piece. Eventually, the final rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, and the corridor outside beckoned them back to the mainstream bustle of the estate's night routine, a staff setting the dinner table, softly lit lamps guiding the way. Thorn extended an arm, and Aspen once again served as his guide, though she felt him guiding her in return with each quiet question and steady footstep. The hush of the halls seemed gentler now, as if acknowledging that something deeper than a contract was beginning to grow under this roof, a bond between two souls who had fled the worlds that hurt them, and who now, through the shadows of secrecy, dared to find solace in each other's company. Night fell upon Thornwood Manor like a gentle shroud, bringing with it a hush that settled into every corner of its vast corridors. A modest dinner had been laid out in one of the smaller dining rooms, where only a few staff members hovered silently at the edges of the candlelit space. Aspen, seated across from Thorn, traced her fingertips over the linen napkin in her lap as she tried to calm the knot of nerves in her stomach. She had shared so many quiet afternoons with him over the past weeks, guiding him around the estate, describing each hidden painting and elegantly crafted sculpture, yet supper together in such an intimate setting felt like a new threshold. The flickering glow of the tapers illuminated Thorn's calm features, emphasizing the sightless gaze that, paradoxically, seemed to perceive more than mere vision could. They spoke softly of the day's small events, of the house staff's ongoing attempt to reorganize the neglected solarium, of a new shipment of antique books that had arrived for Thorn's library. Aspen, without thinking, offered a playful description of the worn leather covers and their embossed titles, forgetting that he'd never see those spines again but might appreciate her depiction. She paused, fearing she might have struck a tender nerve. But Thorn's expression only warmed, an almost imperceptible smile curving his lips, gratitude for her thoughtfulness, perhaps, or acceptance of his condition. Every detail of the dinner, each morsel of carefully prepared food, the faint swirl of spice in the air, seemed charged with an emotional weight, as though they both realized that something more profound than a contract now bound them in shared spaces and shared confidences. When the meal concluded, he rose from his seat, hand hovering near the carved back of his chair. "Come with me," he said softly, the request both an invitation and a challenge. With quiet relief, she placed her hand upon his forearm, guiding him out of the dining room and into the hushed corridors that had become their mutual territory. The staff had withdrawn to their own tasks, leaving the manor in a dreamlike calm. A hush of wind tapped against the tall windows, ushering them along until they entered a narrow passage she had never explored, which led to a locked door set with ornate iron hinges. Thorn produced a small brass key from his jacket pocket. "I thought I'd show you something," he murmured, turning the key in the old lock. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a spiral staircase descending into the depths beneath the manor. Cool, slightly musty air drifted up from below, carrying a hint of dust and aged stone. Aspen cast a questioning glance at Thorn, but he only nodded, his features laced with a certain anticipation. Curiosity and a flicker of trepidation propelled her forward, and carefully, step by step, they descended the winding staircase. At the bottom, they emerged into what appeared to be a hidden wing of the estate, a corridor lit by a row of sconces that gave off a subdued glow. The floor was of old stone flags, the walls lined with small alcoves. "These rooms belonged to my ancestors," Thorn explained, his voice echoing softly in the stillness. "They were collectors, archivists of a sort, storing away not just art but more personal remnants, letters, diaries, things they thought too intimate for the public eye." He paused, his cane tapping lightly on the stone. "Some of it is worthless in monetary terms, but it remains valuable to me for reasons that go beyond coin." Aspen led him forward slowly, her heart thrumming with the sense of stepping into a chamber of secrets. Row upon row of wooden cabinets and shelves lined the walls, each drawer labeled in a spidery script. The space smelled faintly of parchment and time. "Why show me this?" she asked quietly, brushing her fingers along the dust that settled on an old trunk in the corner. you could have kept it hidden, your own private domain. He inhaled deeply, as though fortifying himself. Because trust, he said, turning his head as though meeting her gaze though he saw only darkness, isn't built on bargains alone. You've given me glimpses of your presence that I don't fully understand, but I sense in you a kindred desire for honesty. This wing, these artifacts, are my family's truths. I want you to know that I don't desire a superficial bond. If we are to move forward, it must be rooted in something more authentic than the forced arrangement that brought you here. Aspen felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. She recalled her own carefully guarded secret, the wealth and status she had hidden to avoid her exploitative relatives. In this moment, Thorne's confession of trust tugged at her conscience. She could almost feel the lies she carried thrumming like a living creature beneath her skin. Her lips parted, wavering with the impulse to lay bare the truth of her background, of how she had deliberately become the impoverished orphan he believed her to be. But fear held her back, the memory of family manipulations snapping at her like a vicious hound. And so she remained silent, torn by the paradox of wanting to meet his openness with equal candor and the dread of losing the fragile closeness they had established. Instead, she turned her attention to one of the wooden chests and gently lifted its lid. Inside, she found a collection of personal letters tied with ribbon, the pages faded and the ink blurred from age. Carefully, she picked up a handful, describing them to Thorne, the swirling script, the initials at the edges of each page. She read a few lines, stumbling over archaic phrases that hinted at romances and intrigues of decades gone by. Thorne listened with that intense stillness she'd come to recognize, occasionally asking questions about the letterhead's crest or how the lines might be spaced on the page. The hush of the subterranean corridor made every whispered word ring poignant, a testament to the intimacy they shared in the darkness. As they explored trunk after trunk, she sensed that each carefully preserved memento, whether love letters or old sketches, served as a silent chronicle of the manor's hidden stories. In those quiet hours, reading aloud scraps of genealogies and personal diaries, they drew closer, forging an unspoken bond rooted not just in the contract that once overshadowed them, but in the peculiar synergy that grew with each breath. Thorne's appreciation extended beyond words. He often tilted his head, as though savoring the swirl of memory or imagining the scenes depicted. And Aspen, with each new discovery, felt the ache of her own secrets intensifying, like a weight pressing against her chest. Eventually, they reached a battered chest whose worn exterior bore no title. Something about its unassuming presence intrigued Aspen. Within, she found a smaller leather-bound notebook, no more than 100 pages. Its parchment felt brittle under her fingers. Scrawled lines of uneven handwriting filled each page. Carefully, she began to read, her voice resonating in the confined space. It seemed to be a diary from a distant ancestor, describing the heartbreak of losing a loved one in an accident, the struggle of managing the estate alone. The final pages evoked a tender vow that love, fragile as it was, could endure betrayal, distance, even the passage of time, if both hearts dared to hold on to faith. Thorne's face remained impassive, but he lightly touched her arm. Through that simple contact, she sensed a swirl of emotion that words couldn't capture. In the stillness that followed, they closed the trunk and made their way back up the spiral stairs, each step heavier with the reflection that trust is a precarious, infinitely precious gift. Returning to the candlelit corridor, their hearts pulsed with the knowledge that the secrets below were only one layer of Thornwood Manor's tapestry, and that somewhere, within each of them, lay personal truths waiting to be revealed or withheld. As they parted for the evening, Aspen felt his gentle fingertips brush her wrist in a silent farewell, as if to say, "I see you, even though I cannot see." It was a sentiment that clashed with her concealed identity, stirring her guilt and longing in equal measure. She retreated to her quarters, mind churning with the question of whether she could ever truly meet Thorne's earnest offering of trust when she herself harbored such a monumental lie. And as she lay on her bed, darkness cloaking her thoughts, she wondered whether love would one day guide her to tear down the final mask, or if fear would keep her forever bound in the twilight of unspoken deception. Mid-morning sunlight spilled into the east wing corridor, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in Aspen's wake as she made her way toward Thorn's study. Her heart thrummed with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. The days she'd spent in Thornwood Manor had begun to blur into a tapestry of hushed conversations, midnight confessions, and a gentle closeness she had never expected to share with the enigmatic, blind billionaire. Each morning, she rose with a renewed sense of purpose, assisting Thorn in small tasks, reading to him from centuries-old tomes, or recounting mundane details of the day as though painting a world he could almost see through her eyes. Yet beneath their growing companionship, the persistent strain of her own secrets gnawed at her conscience, a secret name, a hidden fortune, and the fear that her precarious facade might soon unravel. She paused outside the carved mahogany doors of the study, collecting herself before knocking softly. Thorn's voice, low and calm, invited her to enter. Inside, the large windows framed a view of the rolling estate grounds, awash in gentle morning light. He stood by a grand desk laden with files and folders, the subtle tension in his posture suggesting the business burdens he still carried, despite his reclusive life. At her approach, he inclined his head in welcome. Even sightless, he seemed to track her presence with uncanny accuracy, as though her smallest breath or faintest footstep guided him more surely than any map. "I hoped you might read these letters to me," he said quietly, gesturing toward a stack of correspondences sealed with wax. "They arrived by courier this morning, business matters, I suspect, though I'd rather not rely solely on my aides for every detail." There was an undercurrent in his tone, an unspoken confidence in her ability, and perhaps a desire to share more of his affairs with her. She nodded, stepping closer to the desk, carefully gathering the letters. She took a seat in a leather-backed chair, noticing how he angled his face toward her, as if the warmth of her presence eased the strain on his brow. She began reading, her voice low but articulate, weaving through lines of formal language about property rights, shipping deals, and proposed legal amendments. Occasionally, she paused to rephrase a particularly dense paragraph, mindful that Thorn might want a clearer explanation than the stiff corporate jargon provided. He listened intently, the faint drumming of his fingertips on the desk the only sign of his internal reaction. Every so often, he asked a pointed question or requested that she reread a sentence, his mental sharpness evident as he connected each piece of data with practiced efficiency. Despite the dryness of the content, Aspen found a curious sense of fulfillment in the task. She was not merely reading words but acting as a bridge between the written world and his keen intelligence, an intimacy of intellect that supplemented their emotional closeness. Eventually, the last letter lay completed, leaving the two of them in a companionable silence. Outside, a breeze stirred the stately old oaks, their leaves tapping lightly against the windows. Aspen set the letters aside, glancing at Thorn with a tentative half-smile. "That's the lot," she said, her voice betraying a hint of relief. "Nothing terribly urgent, from what I can tell, though there's mention of an upcoming financial summit that might require your presence in the city." Thorn exhaled, nodding absently. "I suspected as much," he replied. "Still, I appreciate your thoroughness. Having you read the letters, it reminds me of how I used to devour every word with my own eyes before." He caught himself, jaw tightening in an echo of old wounds. Yet he quickly schooled his features, offering her a measured inclination of his head. "Thank you. You've become indispensable here, in more ways than one." Aspen lowered her gaze, conflicted warmth blossoming in her chest. She wanted to tell him everything then and there, her real name, the locked inheritance, the manipulative guardians she had fled. The words hovered on her tongue, but fear triumphed yet again. Would he accuse her of deceiving him from the start? Would the fragile trust between them collapse under the weight of her withheld truth? Her breath caught, and she forced a small nod. "I'm just happy to help," she managed, her voice subdued. "And I want to be more than just a mouth reading pages to you. I want to stand beside you, if you'll let me." At her admission, Thorn's posture stiffened slightly, but his face betrayed a flicker of what might be relief, or longing. He extended a hand toward her, not quite touching but close enough that she could sense the inviting warmth of his palm. She responded by placing her hand lightly over his, and in that moment, a profound tension seemed to dissolve. The contract that had initially governed their relationship, the notion of exchanging her innocence for financial salvation, felt distant, nearly irrelevant compared to the bond that had begun to form through stolen moments of sincerity. Their peaceful interlude was disrupted by a knock on the door, preceding the discreet entrance of Thorne's chief aide. The aide, face composed, reported that a visitor awaited in the main hall, a figure from the outside world, bearing urgent news. Thorne stiffened, releasing Aspen's hand, his expression turning guarded. He directed the aide to have the visitor wait in the lesser reception room. Aspen sensed a shift in him, as though unseen walls had descended. She realized that, as close as they'd grown, his realm of business and old rivalries still overshadowed him like a persistent storm cloud. Curious and concerned, she followed at a respectful distance as Thorne navigated the corridors, cane tapping lightly. He moved with precision, though he paused occasionally as if listening to some internal gauge. The lesser reception room was a cozy yet formal space, sporting plush chairs and tall windows draped in soft fabric. Standing near the hearth was a man with a stern countenance, wearing an expression that spoke of both apprehension and duty. He introduced himself as Emmett Drake, an attorney specializing in corporate law, who apologized for his unannounced visit. From the man's clipped tone and measured words, Aspen gleaned that something significant was brewing in the world Thorne had mostly sequestered from. In a tense, clipped exchange, Drake explained that there were new developments in a pending lawsuit tied to Thorne's corporate holdings, allegations of unethical deals, apparently dredged up by a longtime adversary. Aspen watched in concerned silence, noticing the pallor that crept across Thorne's face. She could almost feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, though he kept his composure. The next half hour passed in hushed conversation about legal strategies and potential ramifications for Thorne's public image, with Drake warning that this adversary might soon resort to personal smears. All the while, Aspen hovered at the edges of the discussion, uncertain if she should excuse herself or remain. Yet Thorne made no move to dismiss her, tacitly inviting her to share in his burdens. Eventually, Drake departed as swiftly as he'd come, leaving Thorne standing by the grand windows, cane in one hand, the other clenched in a silent display of frustration. Aspen stepped closer, speaking in a gentle tone. "You shouldn't face this alone," she murmured, recalling how often he'd told her she was free to confide in him. Now, roles reversed, she wanted to offer him the same emotional sanctuary. "If there's something I can do, some way to help, please tell me." For a moment, he said nothing, his blind gaze directed toward the horizon as though seeking solace in the intangible. Then he turned, taking a measured breath. "You're kind," he said quietly, "but this is a war I've fought for years. Rivals in the business world see my blindness as weakness. If they can't destabilize my empire through legitimate means, they'll stoop to personal attacks. I thought isolating myself, living behind these walls, would keep me safe. But I see now that was folly. The more I hide, the more they think I can be cornered." His words struck a chord in Aspen. She, too, had hidden behind layers of lies and distance to protect herself. Perhaps, she realized, their shared impetus to seclude themselves was a double-edged sword, forging a fragile peace but also leaving them vulnerable when the outer world came knocking. Steeling her resolve, she placed a hand lightly on his forearm. "We'll figure it out," she said with as much confidence as she could muster, ignoring the swirling fear in her gut. "We'll stand together against them." The vow slipped out before she could weigh its implications, echoing the deeper closeness that had grown between them. Thorne's blind eyes swept in her direction as though searching for the sincerity in her voice. At last, he offered a faint nod, the tension in his face loosening just enough to hint at gratitude. "Then let's not cower in the shadows," he replied, voice steady. "I have no illusions about the battles I must fight. But if you're at my side, perhaps it won't seem so impossible." He turned away, returning to the desk to sort through some files Drake had left. Aspen exhaled a quiet sigh, the day's events spinning in her mind like an unsteady carousel. Even as she supported him now, she felt the ever-growing pang of her undisclosed identity. She was helping a man she'd come to admire, perhaps even love, without him knowing the full truth of who she was. Could she keep such a secret forever, especially with a lawsuit and media speculation potentially looming? When, at last, she left him to his business, crossing the corridors back toward her rooms, the setting sun's orange glow fell upon Thornwood Manor's immaculate floors. The hush that enveloped the estate felt heavier with each step. She realized she was entangled in more than a contract for security and intimacy, she was enmeshed in a struggle that could decide Thorn's fate in the eyes of the world. And as dawn gave way to the purple hush of twilight, she wrestled with the knowledge that soon, for better or worse, all her hidden truths might be forced into the open. Still, a quiet determination flickered in her chest. If Thorn was willing to stand against conspiracies threatening his empire, so too could she find the courage to confront the lingering shadows of her own past. For the first time since she'd fled her inheritance, she no longer felt she was running, she was choosing to stay, forging a new identity, and if fortune and fate allowed, forging a bond that could outlast the ghosts dogging them both. And so, in that golden half-light, Aspen promised herself she would find a way, no matter how perilous, to reconcile her secret identity with the fragile, blooming love that had rooted in her heart. For a tense and uncertain few days, Thornwood Manor seemed to suspend itself in a hush of waiting, as though every tapestry on its walls and every carved banister in its corridors were bracing for the storm on the horizon. In the aftermath of the attorney's visit, rumors of looming legal battles and personal attacks hovered unspoken in the halls, and the household staff moved with hushed deliberation. Thorn carried on with his usual regimen of phone calls and confidential strategy sessions, his blind gaze fixed on a battle plan he was piecing together in fragments. Aspen, for her part, found herself grappling with a renewed sense of dread. Seeing his composure under threat made the fragility of their bond all the more urgent. One evening, she drifted into the Manor's music room after dinner, following the soft echo of piano keys. The spacious, wood-paneled chamber was lit by a single standing lamp, casting a warm circle of light over the polished grand piano at its center. Surrounded by instruments in glass cases, a violin older than the Civil War, a lute from some medieval century, Aspen paused by the threshold, heart catching at the sight of Thorn seated at the piano, his face drawn with quiet intensity. Though blind, his fingers navigated the keys with intuitive elegance, coaxing from them a melody that was both soothing and heartbreakingly somber. It felt like a private confession, each note a reflection of the burdens he rarely voiced. She stood there, half hesitant to interrupt, but he must have sensed her presence. The music slowed to a halt, and his chin lifted. "Come in," he invited softly, his voice resonating with a surprising gentleness. Aspen stepped into the lamplight, hardly daring to breathe. The hush in the room made her acutely aware that, in a household so large, such pockets of solitude were cherished and rare. She drew closer, leaning a hip against the piano's edge. "You play beautifully," she murmured. "I had no idea you were so accomplished." She halted, thinking of how little she still knew of the man behind the formidable reputation. This was the first time she'd seen him engage his senses in such a raw, expressive way. His lips curved in a fleeting smile. "I used to play more frequently before the accident. After I lost my sight, I avoided it for a while, couldn't bear the frustration of not seeing the keys. But eventually I realized music was something I could still claim, a solace I wouldn't let the darkness take from me." The confession pressed on Aspen's chest, mingling empathy with a twinge of guilt. Despite the tenderness growing between them, she'd hidden so much of herself. Before she could weigh the consequences, words tumbled out, half-formed and tremulous. "You've been through so much," she said, "and still you fight on." She paused, swallowing a rush of emotion. "I wish I had your courage, Thorn. I wish I could say I have no secrets, but..." Her voice trailed off, giving her just enough clarity to stop herself from unmasking her real name. The fear of unraveling everything in an ill-timed moment seized her heart. He must have sensed her turmoil because he turned his face toward her, his blind eyes reflecting concern. Aspen, he said, using the name she'd given, I know you carry burdens of your own. You've confided little fragments about fleeing your old life, though never the details. I won't force you to speak until you're ready. But, his voice softened, a quiet plea underlining his words. Know that my door is always open if you decide to trust me with your truths. Our arrangement, it means little if we can't share honesty. I don't want you to feel like a stranger in my home, or in my life. Her eyes stung with the threat of tears. He had given her more compassion than she'd received from her own kin, who had either ignored or sought to exploit her. She nodded, blinking rapidly, and lightly placed a hand over his on the piano keys. Thank you, she whispered. I need a little more time. They fell into a companionable silence then, the hush broken only by the faint hiss of the lamp and the quiet thrum of the estate's nighttime pulse. Thorne's hand rose to hover over the piano again, as though he might resume playing. Yet, the moment had shifted. The weight of their confessions, even those unspoken, lingered thick in the air, bridging the divide that once was formed by a contract. After a while, Thorne stood, guiding her gently by the elbow. Come, he said, his voice carrying a hush of midnight secrets. I'd like some fresh air. Will you walk with me in the courtyard? The gardens are lovely under the moonlight. Acquiescing with a soft nod, Aspen led him out of the music room and through a side corridor that opened onto a small stone courtyard enclosed by high walls. The sky above was a canvas of shifting stars, and the moon's glow gave the carefully groomed greenery an otherworldly radiance. A fountain burbled at the courtyard center, its water shining silver in the dark. Crickets chirped, serenading the hush that settled between them. As they ambled slowly, side by side, Aspen described the courtyard in gentle detail, the ivy laced over the walls, the cluster of night-blooming flowers that emitted a faint perfume. Thorne leaned in to catch her every softly uttered word, his blind gaze turning toward where she gestured. Every now and then, he would ask a question, about the shape of a blossom, or the reflection of moonlight on still water. In the tranquility of that walled garden, with the hush of the manor behind them, they found a refuge from the lawsuits and schemes that loomed just beyond. Eventually, they settled on a wooden bench near the fountain. The gentle trickle of water provided a soothing counterpoint to their quiet confessions. Aspen's hand, almost unconsciously, found its way into Thorne's, their fingers intertwined as if acknowledging a closeness that outstripped the uncertain origins of their bond. She could feel his breath steady, the tension he carried since the attorney's visit easing just a fraction. Drawing in a courageous breath, Aspen softly spoke of the collision of comfort and wariness she felt in his presence. She described how his blindness, which initially intimidated her, had become a source of shared intimacy, how describing each detail to him made her see the world anew. He responded with a grave murmur, explaining that her perspective had bridged a gap he'd long believed insurmountable. In all my years since losing my sight, I've never felt quite so at ease asking for descriptions or trusting them, he said, a sincerity in his tone that tightened her chest. You give me more than images, Aspen, you give me the sense that I'm not simply an observer in life, but an active participant. Tears pooled at the corners of her eyes. She gently pressed his hand, swallowing the words burning at her throat, I am not who you think I am. She yearned to speak it, to reveal her true name, the hidden inheritance that had forced her into anonymity. But the fear that he would see her as a liar, that this sweetness between them would be shattered, kept her silent. For a few stolen moments, she clung to the illusion that they could exist in this peaceful bubble, ignoring that the rest of the world clamored for their downfall. In a hush that felt like the nighttime hush of an ancient cathedral, he lifted his free hand to trace her face with delicate caution, as if memorizing her features in the moonlight. The gentle exploration sent warmth coursing through her veins, a reassurance that though they had begun as strangers bound by a contract, something authentic had emerged between them. When his fingertips brushed her cheek, she shut her eyes, resting against his touch, tears slipping free in a mixture of comfort and anguish at her withheld truths. Eventually, words were not needed, the silent presence they shared eclipsed any explanation. The night wore on, stars gleaming down upon them, a cosmic audience to two souls converging across the wide gulf of misunderstanding and fear. When, finally, they rose to return to the manor's interior, the first hint of dawn tinted the eastern sky with pale violet. Arm in arm, they made their way inside, the hush in those stately corridors greeting them like old confidants. Her heart pounded with both dread and resolve. She knew that the illusions sustaining her mask of poverty could not last forever, not if she truly meant to remain by Thorn's side, her conscience weighed each day by an unfolding tenderness that demanded truth. Before parting at her chamber door, Thorn paused, cane in one hand, his other lightly cradling hers. "Thank you for tonight," he said in a voice that carried gratitude and a flicker of longing. "Sometimes I forget that, in the darkness, I can still find beauty. You've reminded me it's possible." He offered a half-smile, blind eyes turned toward her as though seeing not her outward guise but the shape of her compassion. In those final moments, Aspen could only offer a trembling, unsaid vow in return, stepping inside her room as the sun began its slow rise. The door closed, but sleep would not come easily. Under the faint rays of morning, she lay awake, heart thrashing in her chest as she weighed the cost of revealing all versus the cost of continuing to hide. The hush of Thornwood Manor was no comfort, for inside her, a tempest brewed that demanded resolution, one that would challenge her vow of secrecy and perhaps decide the fate of the love she dared to crave. For days, the storm of unspoken truths and looming threats hovered over Thornwood Manor, darkening its high-ceilinged halls with tension. Even the staff, usually efficient and discreet, moved about with hushed urgency, their eyes flicking anxiously toward Thorn Kingsley whenever fresh rumors about the impending lawsuit or scandal filtered in. Aspen, beset by her own guilty secrets, watched the man she had grown to care for fight to maintain composure in the face of swirling uncertainty. Their nightly talks, once tender and probing, had grown taut with unvoiced apprehensions. Each conversation skirted the edges of revelation but never quite broke through the final barriers. It was as though both recognized that the moment they laid everything bare, their fragile peace could either bloom into real love or collapse under the weight of betrayal. Then, in the hush of an early evening that felt ominously still, the tension finally ruptured. Through the tall windows that framed the manor's entrance, Aspen glimpsed several dark vehicles rolling up the winding drive. An unsettling prickle ran down her spine as she realized the arrivals weren't the usual staff or suppliers. Only a handful of strangers emerged, stern men in suits, one of them unmistakably a lawyer or official of some sort. She felt the shift in the manor's atmosphere at once, harried whispers in the corridors, a sudden hush as staff members parted to let these new arrivals pass. Summoned to the drawing room where Thorn had chosen to receive them, Aspen hesitated just outside the door. The muted thrum of anxious voices reached her ears, a man's clipped tone reciting legal jargon, Thorn's voice pitched low in a calm but steely retort. But it wasn't until another voice intruded, distinctly feminine, that Aspen felt her heart stop. It was a voice she recognized all too well, one that had echoed through the gilded halls of her old life. She peered through the doorway's narrow opening, her stomach twisting at the sight of her paternal aunt, Eve Aldridge, the aunt who had once vied for control of Aspen's inheritance and manipulated her every waking move. The scene within left no doubt. Her aunt, accompanied by the lawyer and a pair of silent, unyielding guards, was confronting Thorn. Though blind, Thorn stood tall, facing them with unflinching resolve, his cane in one hand, the other at his side, held with the quiet confidence that had become his hallmark. From her vantage point, Aspen caught pieces of the conversation, her aunt claiming that her niece, an heiress, had been lured here under false pretenses, that the unscrupulous Thorn was exploiting her vulnerability. Aspen's cheeks burned at the slander. She realized with horror that her aunt had discovered her whereabouts, likely through the same means that had forced Aspen into hiding in the first place. "Where is she?" Eve demanded, sweeping a cold gaze over the drawing room. "You cannot hide her from us, Mr. Kingsley. We have the means to prove you've coerced her into this immoral arrangement." She brandished a set of documents at Thorn, who remained as impassive as stone. The staff and the lawyer beside him looked uneasy, clearly uncertain how to defuse the standoff. A wave of conflicting emotions surged through Aspen. Her aunt's claim stabbed at her pride. Whatever arrangement she had with Thorne, it was far from coercion. Yet more than anger, she felt dread at the idea that the illusions she had maintained were unraveling in real time. She realized that if she remained hidden, Thorne might be forced to defend himself alone, subject to insinuations and half-truths. Steeling her nerves, Aspen stepped into the drawing room. The hush that descended was profound, every face turning toward her. Her aunt's eyes flared with triumph, then confusion, as she took in Aspen's unassuming clothes and the aura of closeness she radiated with Thorne. Thorne, for his part, inclined his head toward the faint sound of her approach, quietly acknowledging her presence. Aspen's heart slammed in her chest, but she knew there was no turning back. She met Eve's gaze directly. "I came here of my own free will," she declared, voice trembling but resolute. "No one coerced me or lured me. If anything, I sought refuge from you and the manipulations of our so-called family." Eve recovered from her shock swiftly, her features twisting into a sneer. "Refuge? From me? I have protected your inheritance from vultures who would tear it from your naive hands. You repay me by selling yourself to a blind man for security?" She gestured at Thorne as though he were an object unworthy of dignity. Heat flared through Aspen's veins at the insult, and she felt Thorne stiffen next to her, though his posture remained outwardly calm. "He is no trickster," she spat, "nor a predator. I came here because my life was at risk of being stolen from me in more ways than one. Not that you ever cared about my well-being, only about controlling what you could of my fortune." In that charged silence, the staff hovered at the room's threshold, uncertain whether to intercede. Thorne's quiet voice finally cut through the tension. "If you have documents or allegations, present them. But do not insult my household or Miss Ashford with baseless slander. The arrangement we shared is not for you to twist into your narrative." A wave of shock rippled over the room as Thorne addressed her by her real surname. Aspen's breath caught. Somehow, he had guessed or discovered her identity. Perhaps an internal investigator had gleaned the truth behind her false name. A flush of adrenaline and shame flooded her. She had tried so hard to keep the charade intact, but the man who had begun as a mysterious benefactor had evidently uncovered the truth on his own. Her aunt's smirk hardened, even as she whipped around to face Aspen with renewed fury. "So you have been found out. Do you think that absolves you of your responsibilities? The estate, your father's inheritance, they are your birthright, and we shall not allow you to squander them here." She cast a scornful glance at Thorne. "You are nothing but a cunning charlatan, Mr. Kingsley, preying upon my niece's weakness, her ignorance of the business world." Before Thorne could respond, Aspen stepped forward, placing herself between him and her aunt's scornful gaze. "No. I will not let you brand him as a villain, not when you were the one trying to sign away my life in a marriage of convenience, or God knows what deal you had planned. Thorne has shown me more respect, more compassion, than you ever did. And if you think you can intimidate him with your evidence, you don't understand him, or me, at all." Eve's lawyer cleared his throat, evidently wary of the emotional stakes swirling around the room. "Miss Ashford," he began, "we have reason to believe Mr. Kingsley's actions may constitute undue influence. We can seek an injunction if necessary." But Aspen refused to yield, shaking her head vigorously. "You are welcome to try your litigation, but you won't find me testifying against him. We entered this arrangement by mutual consent, and it's grown far beyond that. This has nothing to do with any forced agreement. I made a choice, just as I am making a choice now, to stay here, of my own will." Her voice wavered on the last words, betraying the swirl of emotions roiling beneath. A beat of silence ensued, then Thorne's hand, holding his cane, rose to lightly rest on her shoulder in a subtle show of solidarity. The gesture was small, yet it radiated a protective energy that neither Eve nor her entourage could easily dismiss. A hush fell, and in that breathless moment, it seemed that the entire weight of Aspen's past, her flight, her secrecy, her hidden identity, collided with the new life she was forging by Thorn's side. She realized that the lie she had told him, even if he'd uncovered it, was overshadowed by the deeper loyalty she now displayed, defending his name in front of the family who had long threatened her. The tension snapped when Eve turned on her heel, face taut with thwarted rage. "You are a fool, child," she hissed. "And you, Mr. Kingsley, will regret crossing me." She motioned to the lawyer and the silent guards, who followed her out, leaving the threat hanging like smoke. The staff parted to let them pass, their footsteps echoing long after they vanished. In the abrupt stillness, Aspen became aware of her trembling, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She turned to Thorn, her eyes misty with tears she refused to let fall. He tilted his head in her direction, voice muted yet firm. "So you are an heiress, Ashford," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a hint of reproach. "I suspected something of the sort, given the glimpses of elegance in your speech, the knowledge of things you tried to conceal. But I never pressed, because I hoped. I wanted you to trust me enough to tell me yourself, in time." A current of subdued hurt wove through his tone, though he tried to keep it in check. Shame crushed her chest, and she forced herself to meet his blind gaze. "I wanted to, Thorn. I was scared of being used again, by them, by anyone. I know you must feel betrayed that I let you believe I was penniless. But this is me, trying to stand with you. I don't want your money or a life of hidden illusions. I only want to break free from their control, and I thought, maybe, with you, I could find real freedom." Her confession hung in the hushed air, trembling with the possibility of either condemnation or acceptance. Thorn closed the distance between them, cane tapping lightly on the floor. Gently, he lifted a hand to her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear that threatened to slip past her lashes. "I cannot condemn you for defending yourself the only way you knew how," he said at last, voice calmer than she expected. "We both entered this arrangement with secrets, mine was the extent of my loneliness, yours the truth of your inheritance. But everything that has passed between us has grown beyond bargains. If I am to lose everything in a corporate war, or if your guardians seek to pull you away, I will not forfeit the bond we've forged." He paused, as though bracing against the swirl of danger and relief that battered them both. "Tonight has shown me your loyalty. And that means more than any contract we once believed in." With those words, his fingertips found hers, curling them together in a motion that spoke louder than oaths. Aspen breathed out, the tears she had been holding back dissolving into a fragile sense of hope. They stood together in that grand drawing room, the staff discreetly withdrawing, leaving them alone in the aftermath of the confrontation. She realized with stark clarity that the illusions she had built to protect herself had been torn down in one dramatic moment. Yet, paradoxically, the destruction of her mask opened a path toward the very freedom she had craved, the freedom to love and be loved for who she was, not what she possessed or lacked. Thorn, for all his rumored cruelty and aloofness, had shown her a gentleness that overshadowed any memory of her manipulative relatives. They were two souls, battered by the worlds they'd fled, discovering that in each other's arms lay the promise of redemption. Outside, the night deepened, the sky inky black above the estate's silent grounds. Within Thornwood Manor, though, a new dawn seemed to break. In the quiet that followed Eve's dramatic exit, Aspen and Thorn found themselves wrapped in an unspoken vow. Their illusions undone, their secrets laid bare, they could finally stand united against the external threats that threatened to pull them apart. The tension of the day lingered, but in the hush of that grand room, with the flicker of lamplight reflecting on tears they did not hide, they embraced, a murmured testament to the love that had blossomed in the shadows, and the unbreakable determination to let it guide them into a future they would choose for themselves.